Hello, and today we're going to be having a look at gross negligence manslaughter. So before we begin, let's put this all in perspective because I like to have an overview before looking at the details of the law. So what has essentially happened is somebody has killed somebody else. So we're looking at homicide, i.e. murder and manslaughter. However, the accused is lacking malice aforethought. What is malice aforethought? Well, the courts understand this to mean an intention to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. So therefore, we've distinguished and we've landed at manslaughter. Now, there's two types of manslaughter. There's voluntary and involuntary. Involuntary is where there is no mens rea of murder. And there are three types. You have constructive, you have gross negligence, and you have debatably subjective recklessness. Constructive manslaughter is where you basically construct the conviction of manslaughter on the basis of another less serious crime, such as assault. Gross negligence manslaughter, however, is different. It is based on negligence, which is an area of tort, but also you can be criminally liable when something is as serious as taking somebody else's life. Now, essentially, there is a fourfold process of establishing gross negligence manslaughter. So you need to establish a duty of care, then a breach of that duty of care, then causation, and finally you need to justify that the negligence was so gross so as to establish a criminal conviction. And the leading case on gross negligence manslaughter is Adomaku 1994. So we'll try and discuss it a little bit as we go through, but this is just a summary video anyway, so you can read it if you like. So duty of care, very easy to establish. Basically, it comes from tort, and we have a duty of care not to injure anyone whom we could reasonably foreseeably injure. Generally, for your own knowledge, these come from cases such as the most famous one being Donahue and Stevenson, Lord Acton, Neighbourhood Principle, and also Grant and Knitting Mills. However, for the purposes of criminal law, you're looking at the case of R. and Winter, 2010, where basically the defendant unlawfully stored fireworks without a license, and then when the fire broke out, he misled the fire team. That's the case, but it's Winter, 2010. Now, a duty of care is more difficult to sort of explain when we're looking at omissions, because when you're looking at omissions anyway, you have to establish a duty of care. And the case I'll just briefly mention is R. and Evans, Gemma, 2009. It's a drug supply case. Basically, here the defendant had a duty of care not because she supplied heroin, but because she created a dangerous situation. And it was her failure to call for help, which was an omission, which showed that this had created a breach of duty of care. This is controversial because if she had supplied the heroin and then left, or just given it and then left, she would have no duty of care. It's because she was around there and she created a dangerous situation by being negligent in not calling the medical help that was needed. It's pretty straightforward. Just was it reasonably foreseeable, likely to injure? And if it's an omission, you already have creation of dangerous situation and all those different duty arrangements I've talked about in a previous video. Secondly, then this duty has to be breached. What do we mean by breach? So the defendant had acted in a way that a reasonable person would not have acted. And in particular, when they have a special skill, you have to understand that reasonable person to have that special skill, especially when you pay someone like a doctor to do a certain type of thing just because they have the skill to do it. For example, in Adumaku, the question was whether the reasonably qualified anaesthetist, not an ordinary person, would have realized what was wrong with the patient and intervened to help him. So we're not looking at ordinary persons. So that's a key thing with breach. Causation, normal rules of causation apply, but the key point here being you have to show that it was the negligence that caused the death as opposed to the defendant itself, because it's pretty confusing just talking about the defendant, because that's the case of what we're looking at, his negligent action or omission which caused the death. So in the case of Singh, it was not enough to show that the landlord had acted negligently in not summoning expert help when the gas fires he was told were not working properly, he has to show that even if he had brought the help, would the victims have died? So it's the act as opposed to the defendant's own self. Now, the fourth place is where the issues start to arise, because all the first three are basically general tort principles, but we are giving a person a criminal stigma here. So the law states that the negligence must be sufficiently gross as to justify a criminal conviction. And it leaves the jury with a discretion, basically, and there are different factors the jury will take into account according to Adomaku. For example, how far below did the defendant fall below the standard? Had the defendant foreseen the risk of death? Now, one thing I will say here, though, is even though this is a factor to take into account, even if you did not foresee death, you can still be convicted, because the Court of Appeal made this clear in the Attorney General's reference number 2 of 1999-2001. Then, did the defendant have an explanation for his behaviour? Had the victim put his trust into the defendant to exercise certain skill, like the anaesthetist, the doctor? You're looking at that, and you can also look at subjective elements, basically, so things that were going through the defendant's mind that we've already discussed. Now, before ending, I think it's interesting that in Misra 2005, it was argued that the definition of gross negligence is so vague and it's basically left to the facts of the situation, that they argued it contravened the defendant's rights under Article 6, which is a right to the fair trial. And the Court of Appeal, they disagree and they denied this, and they also refused to redefine gross negligence in light of the case R&G 2003. This is significant because R&G 2003 made recklessness subjective again, and it's a key case. But gross negligence manslaughter remains objective, and I think this is because it comes from tort, where you are looking at the reasonable person. So this is also why the threshold is pretty high for gross negligence manslaughter, because it's easy to commit, basically, compared to constructive manslaughter. Thank you for watching. I hope this has helped.